Strength is not the absence of pressure. It is the refusal to surrender your agency under pressure. The world is organized in ways that constantly test your stability, tempt you to collapse inward, or make you believe that struggle is a personal failure instead of a predictable feature of the system you live in. You stay strong not by pretending those pressures don't exist, but by understanding them, naming them, and then choosing responses that defend your dignity, your direction, and your long term position. Stop internalizing what is structural. One of the quietest forms of self destruction is taking impersonal conditions designed by systems, markets, institutions, or inherited family dynamics and turning them into an indictment of your intelligence, your value, or your destiny. You do not break because life is heavy. You break because you conclude the heaviness is proof of your inadequacy. You think, if I were smarter, this wouldn't happen. If I worked harder, I wouldn't be here. If I were truly capable, I wouldn't struggle like this. But that conclusion is not in sight. It is misdiagnosis. You are punishing yourself for forces you did not design and cannot single handedly rewire overnight. Economic instability is structural. Emotional exhaustion from chronic uncertainty is structural. The pressure to perform, the fear of falling behind, the dead treadmill, the erosion of attention, the invisible competition, all structural. Yet people sit alone in rooms blaming their self discipline, their genetics, their willpower, when what is really crushing them is architecture, not character. We are born into systems before we ever make a decision. We inherit rules before we ever express a preference. We are exhausted by arrangements that existed long before our names were written down anywhere. To internalize structural burdens as personal failure is to mistake weather for diagnosis. No amount of self hatred will change a landscape. You can measure how deeply someone has internalized structure by how they explain their pain. A person who thinks in personal terms says, I am bad, I am late, I am somehow defective. A person who sees structure says, this is predictable under these conditions. This is the cost of this engineering. The second person is not avoiding responsibility, the designed responsibility. They are properly locating the source so they can choose a rational response instead of a self punitive one. Responsibility is not the same as self blame. You can be responsible for your choices without telling yourself the terrain exists because you deserve it. Every structure has psychological side effects. When people live in chronic instability, they develop self doubt as if the instability were proof of their unfitness. When time is fragmented by demands, people assume their inability to focus is a flaw instead of a predictable reaction to being overstimulated. When markets punish slowness and reward constant self advertising, people interpret their exhaustion as laziness instead of a nervous system pushed beyond its biological design. We confuse reaction with identity. We declare crises of character where there are only predictable results of design. Not internalizing structure does not mean you absolve yourself of action. It means you shift the meaning of the struggle. If something is structural, then your suffering is not evidence that you are broken. It is evidence that you are alive inside a system that was not engineered for your long term psychological stability. That reframing alone stops the secondary wound, the wound of shame layered on top of the wound of reality. You still act, but you act from clarity, not self contempt. You intervene without first stabbing yourself. Once you stop internalizing, a psychological gap opens. The distance between the pressure and your identity. In that gap, you regain agency. You can say, this situation is harsh but not personal, heavy but not humiliating, complex but not condemning. You can see that the presence of hardship does not imply the absence of competence. You can endure without narrating yourself as a defect. You can strategize instead of collapse. When pain is depersonalized, it becomes workable. When pain is moralized into self contempt, it becomes paralyzing. Internalization also hides the correct battleground. When you make structural pressure into a self story, You waste energy fighting yourself instead of directing that energy toward redesigning routines, renegotiating boundaries, withdrawing from exploitative arrangements, or building new competencies. The more private the blame becomes, the less public the change becomes. Structure survives best when individuals think the fault is private. The minute you see the architecture, you stop being its silent hostage. Do not ask, "What is wrong with me?" until you have first asked, "What is the design of the environment I am in?" Do not assign your nervous system a gilded for asking for whether the conditions violate what a nervous system can stably carry. Do not conclude you are insufficient before identifying the forces shaping your outcomes. Maybe the obstacle is you, but maybe, and far more often, it is context. And the order of questioning matters. The mind is less cruel when it is trained to investigate before accusing. You do not become weaker by naming structure. You become harder to gaslight. You become harder to shame. You become harder to collapse. You gain a stance from which you can change what is yours to change without confusing everything else with personal failure. Stop internalizing what is structural. The pressure is real, but the self indictment is optional. Interpret adversity as information, not humiliation. Most people collapse not because conditions are impossible, but because they interpret resistance as a verdict on their worth. They don't just face a setback, they conclude the setback means they were foolish to try, that the world has exposed them, that they are out of their depth. The humiliation story is what drains the agency. When you treat adversity as a message instead of a judgment, the emotional weight shifts. You remain a thinker inside the situation, not a defendant standing trial in it. Adversity is a diagnostic tool. It reveals weak links, untested assumptions, false dependencies, hidden illusions about timing or ability or loyalty. Failure is loud information about what reality is willing to grant under current conditions. If you do not convert adversity into information, you will convert it into shame, and shame shuts down the very cognitive functions required to learn from what happened. Shame produces withdrawal, hesitation, and self attack. Information produces recalibration, refinement, and strategic adjustment. People internalize humiliation because they believe that if adversity appears, it must mean they lacked competence from the beginning, but competence only emerges through friction. If you never collide with resistance, you never learn where the structure fails or what your true edge is. The idea that the first battle should go smoothly is the mythology of spectators. Practitioners know that initial conditions are always messy, always inefficient, always humbling. That is not humiliation. That is the cost of entering the arena instead of watching from the seats. When adversity hits, the first question is not, "Why me?" but "What is this teaching?" The frame determines the brain state. A humiliated mind collapses inward and rewrites identity around the wound. A learning mind stays outward, facing and interrogates the pattern. What expectation did this expose as naive? What tolerance or skill was insufficient? What boundary was never enforced? What assumption about people or timing or leverage was inaccurate? What variable did reality reject? These are information questions, not self crucifixion rituals. Interpreting adversity as information also protects your dignity. It keeps the event outside your identity. Losing a job does not mean you are unworthy. It means you were operating inside a structure with priorities you did not control. Being rejected does not mean you are inherently undesirable. It means a specific person under specific conditions did not align with your offering. Missing a target does not mean you are incapable. It means your method or your sequence or your time horizon needs revision. The humiliation narrative claims the event has authority to define you. The information narrative treats the event as one data point in a longer evolutionary arch. There is also a strategic advantage at information based adversity expands your power over time. Each collision with reality updates your internal model. If you remain available to the lesson instead of wounded by the insult, you compress learning cycles. People who interpret adversity as humiliation become brittle. They avoid the next risk, they shrink, they play defensively. People who interpret adversity as information become durable. They iterate, they come back with sharper premises, they accumulate adaptations instead of insecurities. Even emotional pain can be read as information. If a relationship leaves you depleted, that depletion reveals boundaries you did not know you needed. If anxiety spikes in a specific environment, that spike is feedback about misalignment, not evidence you are defective. If solitude feels unbearable, that discomfort is information about your reliance on external validation, a signal pointing to the next layer of development. Pain is rarely meaningless. It becomes meaningless only when you label it humiliating instead of instructive. The humiliation story is seductive because it offers closure. This proves I can't. But that closure is false comfort. It ends the investigation prematurely. The information story keeps the door open. This reveals what I must understand next. One path shrinks your future, the other expands it. One is ego, protective in the short term. The other is power, constructive in the long term. To live without humiliation is not to live without adversity. It is to refuse to give adversity narrative authority. You are not asked to enjoy pain or romanticize struggle. You are asked to harvest it, to treat every blow as a teacher, not a judge, to face the world as an analyst, not an accused. Adversity will visit regardless. The only question is what you do with the visit. If you convert it into humiliation, you get scars without wisdom. If you convert it into information, you get wounds that refine you instead of wounds that reduce you. The mature stance is simple: adversity is not a verdict, it is a briefing. It arrives to expose something you could not see from the safety of comfort. You do not have to like the lesson, but you cannot afford to miss it. Interpret adversity as information, so the event may hurt you, but it cannot define you. Replace frantic reaction with deliberate posture. The moment something threatens your plans, reputation, comfort, or identity, the nervous system demands immediate motion. Fix it quickly, defend yourself, respond now, say something, do anything to relieve the pressure. Frantic reaction feels like action, but it is actually surrender. It hands the steering wheel to adrenaline and fear. The first mover is rarely the strongest player. The first thinker is. Deliberate posture begins with restraint, not motion. The pause is not passivity, it is reconnaissance. In conflict, confusion, or collapse, the mind needs distance before it needs movement. Frantic people answer before they understand, negotiate before they map the power, apologize before they examine blame, retaliate before they identify leverage, quit before they study the terrain. Urgency creates blindness. Posture creates sight. You can feel frantic reaction in the body, shallow breath, fast typing, compulsive calls, impulsive announcements, the urge to clear things up before you even know what things are. The ego wants to preempt judgment. The frightened self wants to restore comfort, even at the cost of making the problem worse. But the strongest people are those who refuse the emotional deadline. They let the discomfort rise without letting it command. They allow time to work as an amplifier of clarity. Deliberate posture is not delay for its own sake. It is delay for extraction. The delay is where you mine information. What exactly is threatened? Ego, control, timeline, or survival? What forces are visible and which are hidden? Who benefits if I panic? What would I regret saying if I spoke from heat instead of cold analysis? What part of this situation is signal and what part is noise? Without these questions, you are not acting, you are flailing. Frantic reaction is expensive. It leaks credibility, burns relationships, exposes ignorance, and often escalates problems that required only containment. The need to prove you are not weak is, paradoxically, what makes you weak. A person who must respond immediately is not in control, they are being controlled. People with power do not chase the timeline set by stress, they impose their own tempo. Deliberate posture converts time into leverage. The longer you wait before moving, the more angles become visible. Emotions cool, data accumulates, other players reveal themselves. Pressure forces others to act impulsively. while you collect their mistakes as intelligence. When you refuse to rush, you force the environment to show its hand. Stillness is a surveillance tool. This posture also protects dignity. Reactivity often produces statements and actions that must later be retracted or apologized for. Deliberate posture keeps your words rare and weighted. In any conflict, the voice that speaks least is usually the one with the greatest perceived strength. Silence is not withdrawal, it is elevation above the noise until you choose your strike with precision. To replace frantic reaction with posture, you must tolerate the discomfort of unacted tension. That discomfort is the price of future power. Most people relieve it by taking any action, even a damaging one, just to feel in motion. Strong people absorb that tension and let it ferment into intelligence. They do not soothe their nerves by sacrificing their position. This shift is not about slowness, it is about sequence. Feel first, act last. Observe first, assert later. Diagnose before deciding, map before moving. You are not losing time by pausing, you are preventing the far larger time loss that reckless reaction creates. The fastest road to regret is to confuse velocity with strategy. The world rewards those who can stay still while others scramble. You gain a psychological height advantage when you do not compete in panic. From elevation, patterns appear that are invisible at ground level. You begin to see where power actually sits, where pressure is manufactured, where exits exist, where allies hide, where traps are laid. Posture turns chaos into a readable map. Frantic reaction makes you easy to manipulate. Deliberate posture makes you unreadable, unhurried, and therefore hard to exploit. People cannot steer someone who refuses to move on impulse. They cannot weaponize your fear if you refuse to speak from fear. They cannot rush you into errors if you deny them the right to set the pace. In every serious moment, ask one clarifying question before you act. Would I still take this action if I waited 48 hours and viewed this from distance? If the answer is no, that means the impulse is heat, not strategy. Heat is always temporary, consequences are not. The ability to sit inside the pressure without discharging it through reckless motion is one of the most transferable forms of strength. In argument, in crisis, in negotiation, in personal upheaval, the person who pauses holds the power. Replace frantic reaction with deliberate posture, and you stop donating control to the situation. You begin to act like someone who directs conditions instead of being dragged by them. The pause is not weakness, it is the birthplace of decisive clarity. Reclaim agency through small controllables. When life feels overwhelming, people make a fatal psychological error. They measure their power only by large outcomes. If the job hasn't changed, the relationship hasn't healed, the money hasn't appeared, the identity hasn't been rebuilt, they conclude there is no control to exercise. But big outcomes are always lagging indicators. They are the final visible result of a long period in which someone steadily controlled microscopic variables others considered irrelevant. Agency is not taken back in dramatic gestures. It is reconstructed in tiny governable acts. A system that leaves you uncertain in the large will tempt you to surrender in the small. You start skipping routines because they feel too trivial in the face of bigger chaos. You stop planning because the future feels unpredictable. You stop regulating sleep, diet, attention, or your environment because these don't solve the real problem. But that is precisely how agency dies, not in a single catastrophic decision, but in a gradual abandonment of what is still within reach. Small controllables are not symbolic, they are infrastructural. When you choose your wake up time, you are not just resetting a clock, you are reteaching your nervous system who commands the day. When you put the phone in another room, you are not just avoiding distraction, you are training attention to obey you instead of external stimuli. When you execute one deliberate task per day under conditions of uncertainty, you are not stalling, you are preserving competence under pressure. These actions are not consolation prizes, they are proofs of force. Agency is rebuilt by showing the self that it can act even when it cannot fix. Those who wait for circumstances to improve before exerting control never regain it. Those who exert control even while circumstances remain hostile slowly create the internal muscle required to leverage future opportunities when they appear. You do not practice agency when the world is stable, you practice it when stability is absent. The ego resists small controllables because they do not produce immediate relief. The ego wants resolutions, not foundations. It wants to fix the external world so that the internal world can calm down. But that sequence hands all power to conditions. True agency reverses the sequence, calm the internal world by mastering controllable micro structures, and then bring that stabilized self to the external problem. The environment bends more easily to someone who is not already bent by it. Small controllables also counter learned helplessness. Chronic unpredictability teaches the brain that effort is irrelevant. The only antidote is consistent proof that effort still matters somewhere. One rep of voluntary discipline per day. One act you do not feel like doing but choose to do interrupts the narrative that you are a passive object of forces. Agency does not require solving, it requires proving. The reason small controllables work is mechanical. The nervous system registers them as signals of authorship. Every small win shifts the internal posture from I endure life to I shape at least part of it. From that posture, you think differently, negotiate differently, and withstand differently. When your internal state is authored by you, external conditions lose their monopoly on your behavior. There is also a compound effect. A person who controls one variable tends to control a second, then a third. Order metastasizes just like disorder does. What begins as a 30-minute reading habit becomes clearer thinking, which becomes better decisions, which becomes different opportunities. What begins as regulating bedtime becomes better cognition, which becomes stronger execution, which becomes changed outcomes. The small is not the opposite of the large, it is the seed of it. A key rule: do not ask your small controllables to solve your life, ask them to stabilize you while you solve it. Their job is not to deliver the final outcome, their job is to build the operating system from which outcomes are pursued. If you demand macro results from micro actions, you will quit before their compounding has time to materialize. The only thing the small must do is prove you are not powerless. In phases where you cannot control timing, you control pace. Where you cannot control other people, you control exposure to them. Where you cannot control outcomes, you control inputs. Where you cannot stop uncertainty, you control preparation. Where you cannot gain clarity, you control momentum. Agency is always available somewhere. The work is to locate it. Reclaiming agency through small controllables is not psychological theater, it is strategy against collapse. It turns life from something happening to you into something that must negotiate with you. You do not need the world to obey to feel powerful. You need to stop obeying helplessness. Control what is still yours, even if it looks insignificant. The small is where personal sovereignty re enters after everything else has been taken. Withdraw cooperation from anything that drains your position. Most losses in life are not inflicted, they are permitted. You are rarely defeated by what attacks you outright. You are weakened by what you continue to feed with your time, attention, emotion, and access. Every draining situation, draining person, draining habit, and draining obligation survives on your participation. The moment you stop supplying oxygen, it cannot keep taking from you. People imagine erosion as something dramatic, betrayal, collapse, catastrophe. But the real bleed is incremental, letting someone speak to you in a tone that lowers your self respect, continuing a conversation that always ends in depletion, tolerating environments that hijack your focus, keeping habits that dull your edge, maintaining roles that consume without reciprocating. You are not powerless in those situations. You are compliant. Withdrawal is not surrender. It is a relocation of loyalty back to your future. Draining forces thrive on two beliefs: I don't have a choice, and it's not that bad yet. Both are lies. You always have the choice to reduce supply, less response, less access, less emotional labor, less exposure, less explanation. And it is always that bad the moment a situation takes more than it returns to your long term position. The threshold is not pain, the threshold is net loss. Withdrawal is not aggression. It does not require confrontation, drama, or public declarations. It is often silent. You stop answering immediately. You stop over explaining. You stop showing up where you are depleted. You stop cushioning consequences for other people. You stop subsidizing sagging dynamics with your energy. You do not need permission. You simply stop feeding what feeds on you. Drains persist largely because they are normalized. If you grow up in environments where self sacrifice is moralized and extraction is disguised as duty, you begin to equate depletion with virtue. You mistake endurance for loyalty and exhaustion for character. But loyalty to what weakens you is betrayal of the self you are responsible to become. Endurance without direction is not strength, it is slow self erasure. Withdrawing cooperation is an act of structural awareness. It acknowledges that every interaction is a transaction, energy goes out, consequence comes back. When the exchange weakens your leverage, the rational move is exit or reduction. The longer you stay plugged into draining circuits, the more you train your nervous system to accept depletion as normal. Once depletion becomes normal, ambush becomes easy. You no longer defend what you no longer believe is yours to defend. There is a compounding effect to withdrawal as well. The first act of refusing to feed a drain strengthens the psychological muscle required to refuse the next one. Boundaries cluster the same way violations cluster. One decisive withdrawal from a toxic loop can trigger a cascade of other exits: social, digital, emotional, behavioral. Suddenly, you are not negotiating with vampires, you are designing a protected internal economy. People fear withdrawal because it triggers discomfort, guilt, disapproval, accusations, temporary losses. That discomfort is not a sign the decision is wrong. It is a sign that exploitation had become habitual. When a drain resists your withdrawal, it is not evidence of your cruelty, it is evidence of its dependence on you. Healthy situations do not punish you for reallocating energy, only extractive ones do. You do not owe your participation to anything that makes you smaller, not to narratives that humiliate you, not to people who compete with your progress, not to systems that reward your silence while taking your labor, not to digital inputs that fracture your attention, not to identities that were built for a previous version of you. You do not have to fight everything. You can starve it. Every withdrawal is a vote for a different future. The energy you reclaim does not sit idle, it re enters the machinery of your development. What once leaked into draining obligations becomes fuel for skill, clarity, health, capital, competence, sovereignty. The cost of staying plugged into drains is not just fatigue, it is the forfeiture of all the compounding your reclaimed energy could have built elsewhere. To protect your position, you must be willing to appear cold to anything that feeds on you. You are not here to be endlessly accessible, endlessly understanding, endlessly available. You are here to build a life that does not require you to constantly repair the damage done by what you tolerate. Withdraw cooperation from anything that drains your position. You do not have to destroy what is harmful, you only have to stop helping it survive. Treat the present as training, not punishment. The fastest way to collapse under a difficult phase is to interpret it as evidence that life is disciplining you for your inadequacy, your lateness, your mistakes, or your supposed unworthiness. Once you label a season as punishment, you instinctively brace, shrink, plead, or endure instead of learn. Punishment mindsets demand endurance. Training mindsets demand evolution. The same hardship interpreted through two different frames produces two different futures. When you think you are being punished, you look backward for the crime, you rehearse your errors, re-judge your past choices, obsess over what you should have done, and narrate your situation as deserved suffering. This is psychic paralysis. It drains energy into self prosecution. training is forward facing. It asks not, what did I do to deserve this, but what capacity is this forcing me to build? Training does not moralize circumstance, it minds it. A training frame restores dignity. Punishment says, you are at the mercy of conditions. Training says, you are being conditioned for capacity. The weight on your shoulders is not a sentence. It is a load under which muscles form. The delay is not a cage. It is a controlled environment in which patience and precision harden. The uncertainty is not chaos. It is exposure therapy for ego control. Hard seasons are not merely endured, they are harvested for traits you could not develop under ease. Most of what people call stuck is in fact a training period they are refusing to see as one. They expect visible results while the invisible rewiring is still underway. They want public proof before private competence is complete. They resent the quiet, the phase when the world is not applauding. Instead of recognizing that all visible transformations are preceded by long stretches of uncelebrated apprenticeship to discomfort. You are not behind, you are underneath construction. Treating the present as training also changes your behavior. If this is punishment, you conserve energy, avoid risk, keep your head down, and wait for the sentence to end. If this is training, you engage with intent. You track signals instead of sulking. You refine instead of resign. You test micro adjustments. You make the phase do work for you. You extract skill, insight, toughness, and clarity out of a reality that was going to be hard whether you learn from it or not. The mind resists the training frame because training implies expectation. You are being prepared for something future, not disposed of. That reintroduces responsibility and possibility. It demands you interpret pain as curriculum, not as cosmic hostility. It removes the secret comfort of helplessness. It insists that your current season is a forge rather than a grave. Many prefer to call hardship punishment because punishment at least offers a simple narrative. This is fixed. Training offers no such closure. It demands you grow inside the discomfort. There is a calm that comes when you rename hardship as training. You stop fighting the presence of the weight and start focusing on how to carry it better. That shift preserves energy. Panic wastes strength by arguing with reality. Training conserves strength by assuming the reality is temporary and purposeful. You do not hurl yourself at the wall, you study the wall until you know where to push, where to wait, where to drill an opening. This stance also prevents identity damage. Punishment logic fuses the event to your worth. This is happening because I am flowed. Training logic separates the event from identity. This is happening to build something in me. Under the punishment frame, you degrade. Under the training frame, you accumulate. One produces shame, the other produces structure. You do not have to enjoy the season to benefit from it. Training does not feel sacred while it is happening. It feels relentless, dull, repetitive, isolating, slow. But nearly every trait people admire, composure, discernment, restraint, precision, depth, is born in phases that look like stagnation from the outside. You are not failing because it is heavy. You are being fortified because it is heavy. The ask is not to pretend suffering is pleasant or to romanticize adversity. The ask is to refuse to give adversity narrative authority. Hard seasons neither prove you are doomed nor prove you are deficient. They prove you are in a stage where unseen competencies are being installed by force. Before you decide this phase is punishment, consider the possibility that it is preparation and that you will not recognize its necessity until you meet the future self that required exactly this resistance to exist. Treat the present as training so the pressure becomes formative instead of scaring.